Okay, some of the next stuff we want to start adding is some of the round managing stuff. So things like managing the score we're getting in the game and the time we have left for our players to complete the level and things like that. So before we do that, we want to start making our level actually look somewhat interesting and not just be our gems floating in the middle of nothing. Now, we're not going to make anything too complicated. We're going to keep this nice and simple, but we're going to make it look slightly nicer to give you an idea of how you can lay stuff out and do whatever you want. But of course, all of this stuff is totally up to you to do in whatever way you prefer. But for our purposes, we're just going to make it look a little bit nicer in the game. So first thing I'm going to do is, with my board here, I'm going to create a child of this. Well, actually, I'm going to drag it into the scene, so I don't know why I'm trying to create it there. What we're going to do is go to our art folder, and in UI, I'm going to grab this block BG here. I'm going to make this a child of the board. And then I'm going to, it is at 0, 0 there. Yeah, that's fine. And then I'm going to increase the size of this. And how I'm going to do that is in my sprite render here. I want, because this is a specific type of block, it's actually something that has been chopped up for us to use quite nicely and to keep the corners nice and round. If I stretch and grab it like this, which adjusts the scale here, you can see the corners get kind of squashed and all stretched out. We don't really want that to happen. So I'm going to put this back to 111. And then what we're going to do is change the draw mode over here from simple to sliced. And we're going to change the width and the height here to be 10 by 10. Not 10 by 10, sorry. Our board is 7 by 7, so we want it to be 7 by 7. So we want it to be the size of the board itself. And then we're going to increase the position of it so that the bottom left corner is where the blocks will start spawning. So if I do this at the moment, you can see this white block is offset from where our blocks are, so we don't want that. So we're going to put the position of it, much like where we move the camera to half the board size minus 0.5, we're going to do the same for our block here. So I'm going to put this at 3 and 3, like so. So now when I play the game, this is covering our back area. Now we also don't want this to appear in front of the little blocks that we have. So I'm going to put this on the BG layer at -1. So it goes behind those little blue blocks laying out our grid. So that's all perfectly fine. That's how we'll have our square in place, or our little background square in place. Then I'm going to duplicate this a couple of times. So I'm going to add one duplicate to it. Then I'm going to put the size to be 7.2 and height to be 7.2. So this is going to be slightly larger. And I'm going to make the color of this a blue color. And I'm going to put it at -2 in the layer. So now we've got a little blue outline around here. Let's change this color slightly. And I'm going to make one more. We'll duplicate the original one again, and this is going to be a width of 7.4 and a height of 7.4. Now I also should point out we're getting this little slight warning because the sprite isn't the correct mode that it necessarily wants, but it is perfectly fine. This is a light warning. It's not a error occurring. Is perfectly fine to use in the actual game itself. Then let's put the order of this at -3 so it appears behind the other ones, and now we have a somewhat nicer looking play area for us to use here. I'm going to get my camera then, and I'm going to change the color of it to be a much nicer kind of light blue color, kind of like this. Let's pull some of the lightness. There we go. So that looks a bit better, and I'm going to adjust it so that the block appears on the right hand side of our screen here. So let's get our camera. I'm going to decrease the size here, the orthographic size, to zoom it in, and I'm going to drag it over to the side here like so. So now our grid will appear right over there. So now we've got all this space over here on the left to put some other elements into our game. So let's stop that. The next thing I need to do is add some UI elements, which is what is going to appear over here on the left. And how UI works in Unity is it'll create a new object that'll be really, really big here, but will only appear as an overlay in our game view. So let's right click over here. We're going to add a UI canvas like so. You can see it creates a nice huge big canvas. And then over here under canvas scaler, I'm going to switch this to scale with screen size and 1920 by 1080, which is the standard resolution for most games. This is the one I'm using by default over here. And it allows us to lay things out in a way that will make sense for most screens that people will use. What we're going to do then is start adding some text in for us to use. So I'm going to right click on my canvas, I'm going to go to UI, and I'm going to go Text Mesh Pro, which is the much improved version of the basic text that used to only come with Unity. So we'll click Text Mesh Pro. When you first click it, you have to import the Text Mesh Pro essentials. So let's import those essentials here, which will give us some default assets that it can use. So we can use the normal font for this. So we've got our bit of text here. I'm going to rename this to be the time, oops, that's not how you spell time, time remain label. I'm going to put the text in here to say time remaining, like so. And I'm going to drag this a little bit bigger and put it over here. And we're going to increase some settings. So we're going to set our font size to be 60. We're going to change our color to be not quite black, but just a kind of very dark gray. Using a very dark gray is usually much preferable to using absolute black in games and in design in general. Having absolute black is kind of a little bit hard on the eye, but having it just a little bit lighter works out much nicer for your games in general. I'm going to hit bold on this to make it bold out a little bit and make it look a bit nicer. So we've got time remaining here. I'm going to duplicate this and say we've got a time remaining value, which will have a default value of, say, I don't know, 100 seconds remaining. So we'll pull this down a little bit. Then I'm going to make sure that this one aligns over to the right hand side, like so. So these are kind of misaligned with each other, but that's perfectly fine. That's what I want to have happen, because then what we're going to do is add a image into this. So I'm going to right click, create a UI image, and this is going to be we're going to call this label BG. Actually no, we'll call this one the value BG, and I'm going to put this behind both of those, and the sprite I want to use is the block sprite that we had down here. And then I'm going to click and drag this over so it goes around nicely around the counter that we had up here. So we'll stretch it over to the right a little bit and maybe up a little bit, like so. So there we go, we have our counter displaying nicely there now. I'm actually going to increase the size of the value here. So let's increase the size of this. Let's go up to 72 for this one. Okay, so we've got our time showing a little bit bigger. Then I'm going to get this value BG, I'm going to duplicate it, and this is going to be the label BG. And I'm going to put this up here. I'm going to change the color of this to be a nice kind of yellowy color. And then I'm going to drag this up behind the time remaining, like so and like so. And then I want to put this label BG behind the other one. So now the way the canvas system works is anything higher on the canvas will appear behind the things that are lower down. Much the same as our layers system when we looked at the sorting layers to present things. So that's our time remaining. Let's move this label over a little bit so that there's space to the left of it. We just want to position it nicely so it looks a bit nicer over there. And then we'll drag this edge of this to be out a little bit. And there we go. So we've got a nice little section here. See, we'll just pop that in like that. There we go. I kind of like how that looks there. So that's how we're going to display what time we have left in the level. Similarly, we also want to display the score we have in the level. So I'm going to duplicate this entire thing and then drag it down. Hit Control and D to duplicate. Drag it down, and then instead of the time remain label, this is going to be the score label. And instead of time remain value, it's going to be the score value. So then score label should obviously say score, and the score value will just be some numbers. So by default I'm just going to leave it at just 0, because obviously you start the level with 0 points. Okay, so there we go. That looks a bit nicer. Now we've got a bit more space down the bottom here. You can see what I was trying to do was fit this into the left of our grid over here. And we've got a bit more space down the bottom, and we're going to put some buttons in there as when we get a little bit further in, but for now we're going to leave it just empty We'll add the buttons to do more functionality when we get to that point, but for now we're perfectly fine. So if I go ahead and play the game now, we've got our gems over here on the right, and we've got space for how much time we have left and the score we have as well. So of course at the moment they're just there looking pretty, they're not actually doing anything, so we need to make them actually start doing something next.